Now I bet you may be wondering, well, that seems odd for an Advent text. We're supposed to be preparing for the birth of Jesus. Why are we reading these stories now? Well, yes, it may be odd. But when we are in this season of Advent, in this time of waiting, in this time of preparing, as we've been thinking about it and kicking it around the office, what we came to was this season of Advent is really about hospitality. The ancient Christian tradition of hospitality. Hospitality has long been important, especially in the culture of the Middle East, in the culture where the Bible was written, in the traditions that we hold important to this day. Making welcome, making ready, being prepared. And so in this season of Advent, we are going to be spending some time looking at hospitality, what it means to make space, to make ready, to prepare the way for Emmanuel, God with us. And I think when we think about Jesus, when we think about preparing the way, making space, we like to think of Jesus as a baby. That friendly, welcoming image of the baby snuggled in a mother's arms. It's warm, it's friendly. You can still smell the newborn smell. Anybody know what I'm talking about? That baby smell. It's really, really good, that baby smell, you know? Unfortunately, the Jesus that we meet later in the Gospels, that baby grown up into a man, I think sometimes is harder to welcome than the little baby wrapped in swaddling clothes in a manger. And yet, this is the Jesus that speaks to us out of our lessons for this day, that speaks to us of this radical welcome. And that welcome, I think, might be a little harder to welcome the stranger than to welcome a sweet little baby. But let's take a look at it. In our first story from Genesis, we have 3 strangers that show up outside Abraham and Sarah's tent. How many of you have had complete strangers over for dinner before? Anybody ever had dinner with complete strangers? Yeah? Just imagine what that would be like. If you haven't had a stranger over for dinner, that's okay. Imagine what it would be like to have someone you have never met before come and sit around your table with your family. Imagine trying to make conversation. It'd be a little awkward, wouldn't it? It'd be a little uncomfortable. It'd be a little strange. And yet here are these 3 strangers showing up at the tent of Abraham and Sarah. Older, settled in their ways, used to their routine, and here are these 3 people that show up. And one of them says, "Hey, when we come back next time, you're going to be pregnant." And Sarah says, "I'm sorry, what?" Maybe you didn't notice how old we are. I know you aren't familiar with us, but really not gonna happen. Highly unlikely, right? This sense of surprise, taken off guard. And a little bit of fear, right? a little bit of hesitancy. You don't know these people. And yet, they made them welcome. They had them over for dinner. They listened to their strange prophecies. Welcome is about making space for the unexpected. Making space for the unexpected. Let's turn in our Bibles, if you will, if you can find the Bible in front of you, to Luke chapter 14, where our story comes out of this morning, our gospel story. It's at page 849, if that's helpful for you. It's another story of yet another dinner. Jesus is invited over for dinner. And in our gospel that we read just a little bit ago, I told you the second half of that story. Jesus was invited over, it says in verse 1 of chapter 14, Jesus was invited over to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, and they were watching him closely. That's what verse 1 says. Does anybody have a guess as to why they were watching Jesus closely? Yeah. They didn't know what he would do, and they're Pharisees, and they were wanting to find a reason to arrest him. We are about halfway through the arc of the story in Luke, so the Pharisees are really trying to find a gotcha moment for Jesus. So they've invited him over to this dinner, and Jesus takes some time out to heal someone, and then he notices how these people are posturing themselves and arranging themselves at the table. You see, in this culture, in this day and age, there was a hierarchy to things. Everyone had a place, and everyone knew their place. The closer you were to the head of the table, the more important you were. And the further away from the head of the table you were, the less important you were. And so everyone in this room is bumping elbows, trying to get as close to the head of the table as they are allowed. And Jesus notices this and says that they should sit at the lowest place and be invited to move up further. Hospitality has humility about it. True welcome means being humble about yourself and your place. He says this to the host of the dinner. It's a little brash, isn't it? Someone invites you over for dinner, and then you tell them all about themselves. But Jesus doesn't stop there. No, Jesus doesn't just comment on how they are arranging themselves at dinner and say, "My, that's mighty silly of you." Jesus goes a step further and says, that the true kingdom of heaven will look more like people being welcomed in off the streets than those important people that are already seated around the table. That's a true shocker. Not only the truth that Jesus is speaking, that is what the kingdom of heaven will look like, but the insult to the people who he's sitting with. It's a little hard to swallow, is it not? I know for me, who spent Friday going to stores and shopping and doing my, good old American consumerist thing, that's not really what it's about, this preparing, this making ready. This getting ready for Jesus isn't about all the busyness that I was about. I don't know what you guys were doing, so I can't speak for you, but I know that the push in our culture is to prepare in a completely different way than Jesus is calling us to here. All of the busyness, all of the things that we need to attend to, the taking care of our land, the taking care of our oxen. We would translate that to different things today, I would think. I have to go get my oil changed. There are things that I have to do. I'm too busy. I can't be bothered with that now. It's a different kind of hospitality that Jesus is calling us to here. It's a different kind of making space and being ready. And I don't think that this kind of hospitality, this radical welcome that Jesus is calling us to in this story, is something that we are very comfortable with in our modern days and times. And I would like to invite us in this season of Advent, these next few weeks, to take a look at that, to take a look at our lives, to take a look at what Jesus is calling us to, this radical welcome, and try and create a little space for what that might look like in our hearts, in our lives, and in our homes. So we're going to invite you to do something. There is an old Christmas tradition. Some of the oldest stories date back into Ireland that I found of this tradition. But there are also some Czech that I've heard of, some German. I'm sure there are other stories as well of lighting a candle and putting it in your window as a sign of welcome, as a sign of hospitality. Have any of you heard of this tradition before? A couple of you? A few of you, yeah. Well, this season of Advent, we are going to ask that all of you light a candle in your window just 2 nights a week. I don't know what 2 nights are best for your family, maybe Sunday and Wednesday, whatever that is. But that you light a candle as a symbol of hope, as a symbol of welcome, as a symbol of hospitality. And while you light that candle, you say a prayer for your neighborhood. That we blanket this community in prayer and hope and light this Advent. And not only that, but we want to track it. We want to make a map where we can see all of the lights across our neighborhood. So as you sign up for a candle, our administrative assistant, Kathy Bergeron, will be back there taking some information from you so that we can create a visual picture of the prayers that we are laying over our community this season of Advent, as we open up and create space, not just for the baby Jesus, Emmanuel, but for that radical welcome when that little child grows up, that radical welcome that Jesus is calling us to open our hearts and our homes to the stranger. Will you pray with me? God, we give you thanks this day. We give you thanks that your welcome is for everyone, that there is a place at your table for each and every one of us. And all that you ask of us is that we put aside our busyness and come to the feast that you set before us. God, help us to open our hearts and our minds and our eyes to all those in our midst who are looking for a place of welcome. Open us to the hospitality that you first laid out. May we follow in your image. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.